Welcome to my history channel, and today we are going to look at the Treaty of Versailles. Now let's get into this video. Part 2 of our series will cover the war in the East and the entry of the U.S. into the conflict before ending with the armistice and peace negotiations. The war began in August 1914 after Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. Ferdinand's powerful uncle, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, pledged his support to Austria unconditionally. Because of the complex web of alliances in Europe, the war soon involved most of the continent. The main belligerents were divided into two opposing sides. The Central Powers consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, while the opposing side was known as the Allies or the Triple Entente, consisting of France, Russia, Britain, and eventually Italy and the United States. Germany, the most powerful nation in the Central Powers, found itself fighting on multiple fronts. Initially, they faced only France and Belgium, who were attempting to stop their advance towards Paris. But after defeating the Belgian forces, the Germans were forced to turn around and fight against the British, who had landed in northern France. Further east, the Russians pushed the Austrians back from Poland and then turned south to attack them in the Balkans. Soon, Bulgaria joined the fray, pushing the Russians back. At the same time, the Turks attacked the British in the Middle East. The war continued for another 4 years, until both sides were exhausted. The Western Front, where the Germans and British fought, was characterized by horrific trench warfare and resulted in massive casualties for both sides. There were also significant battles on the Eastern Front between the Russians and the Central Powers. But it wasn't just men who died. Entire communities were wiped out in some places. New weapons such as machine guns, poison gas, and tanks were used, causing unprecedented levels of carnage and death. Total war dead for the entire war is estimated to have exceeded 17 million. For Germany, over 2 million soldiers lost their lives. By late 1918, Germany was facing military defeat on all fronts. Their economy was collapsing, strikes and protests were commonplace, and the German people were tired of the war. On November 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of Germany since 1888, abdicated the throne. This led to the proclamation of the Weimar Republic, which replaced the German Empire. 4 days later, an armistice was signed, ending the fighting. It was the first time in German history that they had surrendered without being invaded. This led to a popular myth in Germany called the stab in the back, which claimed that the war had been lost not on the battlefield, but at home. But despite their terrible situation, Germany had managed to avoid invasion. France had wanted revenge for the devastation that German troops had caused during their invasion in 1914. Many French citizens had been killed, and entire villages had been burned. President Georges Clemenceau wanted to punish Germany and ensure that they never invaded France again. However, the new French government was cautious. They didn't want to be seen as too eager to pick a fight with the Germans, so they tried to push the Americans into taking the lead in negotiating peace terms. There was, however, one place where they agreed that the Germans should be punished. That was Alsace-Lorraine. This region had been taken by the Germans in 1871 and had been the cause of much resentment among the French. Clemenceau met with the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and the Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando to discuss the peace terms. The Italians demanded the South Tyrol region from Austria, while the British wanted colonies in Africa and the Germans' overseas empire to be reduced. Lloyd George even suggested that Germany be broken up into several smaller states. Clemenceau, however, thought this would destabilize Europe and preferred to see a strong and stable Germany as a bulwark against the Russians. The big question was, what role would the U.S. play? President Woodrow Wilson had promised to make the world safe for democracy, but when he came to power, he wanted to limit America's involvement in Europe. He opposed joining the League of Nations and warned European powers not to burden the U.S. with territorial responsibilities. Wilson wanted a peaceful Europe and believed that a fair treaty could achieve this. So he outlined 14 points for achieving world peace, including free trade, open diplomacy, and the right of national self-determination. But he also proposed that Germany be required to disarm, return Alsace-Lorraine to France, and pay reparations for damages. The European leaders liked the idea of punishing Germany but rejected Wilson's call for the United States to oversee the peace. Instead, they created a special organization called the Supreme War Council to draft the peace treaties. The council consisted of representatives from Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. The United States did send a representative to the conference, but he only served as an observer and had no voting rights. Despite this snub, President Wilson still managed to influence the final treaty. The peace talks took place at the Palace of Versailles in France, the very place where Napoleon had declared war on the British 100 years earlier. On January 18, 1919, representatives from the victorious powers met with those from Germany to discuss the treaty. The Germans expected to be allowed to continue with some of their territorial gains in France, but they were in for a surprise. The terms of the treaty were dictated to the Germans, who were given little opportunity to respond. On June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. One of the most important and controversial provisions of the Treaty of Versailles was the War Guilt Clause, otherwise known as Article 231. This article placed sole responsibility for the war on Germany and its allies, stating that they were, quote, firmly convinced that Germany and her allies are responsible for causing all the loss and damage to which the contracting powers have severally become parties. Other key terms of the treaty included Germany losing 13% of its territory, including Alsace-Lorraine, parts of Prussia, and all of its colonial possessions. Its army was limited to 100,000 men and no conscription. Germany was forbidden from having an air force or submarines and was only allowed a navy of 6 battleships. Then there were the reparations. Germany had to pay massive sums to the Allied nations for the damage and loss they had suffered during the war. The amount was initially set at 1 billion gold marks, or about $33 billion in 1919. However, this amount was increased as time went on. In total, Germany paid approximately 1.32 trillion marks in reparations, which is equivalent to about $41.5 billion in 1919. The Treaty of Versailles required Germany to hand over 40% of its iron and coal, 26% of its iron ore, and 10% of its merchant ships. Finally, there was the famous Mirror of Shame. The Germans were forced to build a 500-meter-long and 27-meter-high steel structure near the entrance to the palace that would reflect the Germans' humiliation. Of course, the Germans weren't the only ones who suffered. The Ottomans lost nearly all of their territory, including Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Libya. Austria lost nearly all of their empire, and Italy reclaimed parts of their former territory. The Treaty of Versailles remains one of the most important documents in modern history. It ended World War I and reshaped Europe's political map, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflict and laid the groundwork for World War II. For more on this topic, be sure to check out the next part in this series. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe.